Hello everyone, Jiva Cockdinit. In this video I'd like to talk about how man's relationship to nature has changed since primitive times, and the effects this has on our understanding of our environment and our politics and our attitude regarding our environment and each other. In other words, I'm going to talk about how the change in our relationship with nature has affected the way we interact with one another. And there are really 5 ways I can think of, 4 or 5 ways in which this is the case. So the first way in which our relationship with nature has changed, say, is our physical separation from nature. So, our physical removal from living in the wild and the wilderness to living in the city, or the town, or the farmland, or some domesticated, civilized, modern place. Our removal from nature has sort of truncated our being from that of the natural being. We no longer see ourselves as a part of nature, but rather we see ourselves as some separate entities, some separate body. There are the animals and the wildlife, and then there's human beings as separate to that. In the human consciousness, that is the case today. In the same regard, there is also the moral element. So, in the past, in primitive times, our morality would have simply been a representation of the natural order. When we see a struggle and strength and survival and nurture and these different things which exist within nature, when we see how animals raise their young and how animals compete with one another for resources and how different species feed off each other, prey on each other, compete with one another, interspecies competition and whatnot. When we see how there is that limited amount of space and that a certain amount of struggle is needed for perpetuance to keep living yourself and to keep your bloodline alive, that would have really all been the morality that we would have had in the past. We would have had an animal understanding of morality. It would have been a natural order, as I call it. Whereas today we have an ideological, philosophical morality. We have created a concept of God which has been removed by several degrees from nature itself. Whereas once upon a time, I believe very firmly that there were no gods, but rather people lived like animals, and then eventually spirits were seen to exist within nature itself, just to give us a more conscious understanding of the importance of nature, and then there came personifications of these spirits, and that's the root from where gods come. But today, the concept of God, and let's not just think about the Christian God, let's think of, because we live in a post-God sort of world, but also simply philosophical God. As in the great creative forces that we perceive today, and the great judges and the great judging forces of today are again separate from nature. They're a completely separate thing, and often you'll find they're judging just human beings, not animals. And the sin and the virtue they perceive is human sin and virtue, as opposed to animal sin and virtue. As these two things are completely separate now. That we are such a different entity that even our right and wrong are separate to that which is right and wrong in the wilderness. So that's the second way in which we've been separated from animals, and from nature, and how that's affected us. The third is, say, the aesthetic element. Our aesthetic appreciation, which at one point would have been solely relying on nature, and of course the oldest archetypes are still relatively natural. You'd see, for example, the moon or the sun, or the forest. But in artwork today, what's more common to find is an urban aesthetics, or suburban aesthetics, or rural aesthetics, but not an aesthetics of the wilderness. People look for aesthetics in an urban environment, in like a city. They'll find beauty in the city because they find that as a human environment. Now, of course, aesthetics are all about the human environment. They're all about what is beautiful to human beings, what touches upon the human soul poignantly, and says, there you are. That's your soul. It points it out, and gives it's just another way of giving reason and meaning to it, to the soul. That's the purpose of art. But in modern society, it's mostly an urban aesthetics. If you look at artwork from after the Industrial Revolution, but of course beforehand you also see the same thing, but after the Industrial Revolution we see a spike in this sort of activity. In the 20th century we see it increase by huge increments. In the modern day it's almost universally modernized, urbanized aesthetic understanding that we have of our environment. The fourth way in which this exists, if I remember, is well, I was going to leave this last, but yeah, I guess I could say this now, is that how we use our environment for profit now, more than anything. When we see fruit, or we see other plants, shrubs and whatnot growing, we see a potential to domesticate them and to use them in agriculture, and turn them into cash crops. Something as innocent as a simple grass, which sustained just large animals. It didn't even sustain human beings in the Stone Age. And then yet at the Neolithic we then begin domesticating this, and before you know it, it's a cash crop, a cereal. If something as simple and as innocent as grass can have that sort of fate attached to it, the entire environment can have the same. Something can be domesticated or cultivated even for its beauty. And this is sort of tied in with the idea about how a lot of wilderness today is actually itself cultivated. If you look at trees in a forest, for example, you often find the branches only start quite a while up the tree, whereas in a wild forest they'd start quite low and they'd be wild, they'd be all over the place, because they put I forget the word for it, but they put sort of rivets on the side of the tree, preventing the branches from growing up until a certain point. And a lot of these forests die. In fact, I was going to record a video a while back of another forest near here, which is completely dead, because they've carved paths through the forest, like crisscross tracks, and there were cars driving there and everything, and all of the trees are just planted of the same species. It's mostly alder. They planted alder trees everywhere, and of course these trees die because they can't reproduce in a place where there's no biodiversity. And they do this because they're harvesting them for wood. So that's another example. Which sort of leads me into my last point, but just to finish up on that, it's how we see the wilderness as just another human creation. If you look at holiday resorts and whatnot, which involves some mountain climbing or whatever, I mean, even on Mount Everest, right, it's all a commercial activity. It's all completely structured and organized, and there's queues to get to the top of the mountain. It's you venture into the deep dark forest to go to the sacred shrine, and you see massive queues of monks and pilgrims, often going to touch the sacred tree. It's there's that tree in Lithuania, I believe it's Lithuania, which is 1,500 years old, and it was worshipped by pagans. It was an oak tree. It was a sacred oak to the ancient Baltic people. and it's still standing there. The Christians haven't cut it down, but it's covered in like a metal fence, and it's like big signs saying like "Don't touch" and things like that. It's like this symbol of nature, of that connective force connecting, literally connecting the earth to the divine, and it's nature that's doing that. And it's nature, according to paganism, where our essence comes from, where our fate comes from. And yet, now we just put signs around it saying, "Don't touch." The final example I was going to give was about the heroic element, where we seek adventure and where we see human heroism today. So, in the past, the hero ventures outside of the society into nature to do his heroic deeds, whether this be slaying a dragon and saving a princess, or whatever he does. He has to go out into the wilderness, into the unknown. We see this in the oldest stories, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, right up until early modern sort of knights in shining armor, that sort of thing, knights of the round table, that sort of idea as well. They go into the forest. The knights of Arthur, of King Arthur, they go into the forest to do their deeds and go on their adventures. There's no adventure to be had in the drab cities and in the farmlands. You have to go into the wilderness. That's where the magic is. At least that's the older idea. In modern times, however, if you look at cinema, which I believe is, well, of course it's good cinema as well, but it's mostly a Jewish sort of creation in general. So that's maybe not a good example, that's maybe an unfair example. But if you look at literature today, and in the past, say modernist literature and even romantic literature as well, going all the way back to the 17th century, as opposed to the folk stories from beforehand. In these sort of modernistic stories, all of the heroism and the magic and the adventure takes place in the urban environment. To give an example, take the story Dracula. There is plenty of wilderness in the story of Dracula, but all of the heroism, all of the magic and whatnot, takes place in the urban environment, in the cities, wherever the vampire goes, right? So at the start of the story, where the character goes to Romania, he has to travel through the wilderness to get to this town, and in the town is a castle, and that's where the adventure happens. Then, of course, the magic, the evil, the vampire has to then travel through Romania all the way to London, and that's when the story continues in the urban environment, and the heroism exists there. But of course, if you look at cinema and books and everything today, you'll see the same thing, that the hero is somebody who climbs into society, who engages in heroic deeds within the society, rather than outside it. And this is just one more way. So that's 5 or 6 ways, and that's just one more way in which, after a separation of nature has occurred, how this has affected our human relationships, and how humanity sees itself. If the human soul were to look itself in the mirror, it would no longer see that ash tree, that oak tree, growing tall and strong, spreading its proud, powerful branches, reaching up to the firmament. It would no longer see that. Instead, it would see this abstract shape, this shadow of a sort, which could grow in the same way a shadow could grow, which could mold itself to anything, potentially. In the same way an abstract shape could mold itself to become anything. And we seek catalysts, and we seek other concepts to spur us on, which are just as abstract as we are. Because we can no longer look nature in the eye and see our soul reflected in it. Those are just some quick points I'd like to make. I'm planning on making another video about something similar, about the concept of heaven in modern society, but I think that's a concept for another video. So that's all I'd like to say at the moment.